Bonjour tout le monde, on va commencer. Hello everyone, we'll get started. Je suis Chris Fennell, je suis le directeur de l'école de psychologie ici à l'Université d'Ottawa. Et j'ai le plaisir de faire l'introduction de la professeure Martine Lagacé. Martine Lagacé a été nommée vice-rectrice associée à la recherche en 2018 pour un mandat de 5 ans. Dr. Lagacé is a professor in the School of Communication and also affiliated with the School of Psychology, yay. Et aussi une affiliation avec l'hôpital Montfort. Les travaux de la professeure Lagacé ont grandement contribué à l'avancement de connaissances sur les aspects psychosociaux du vieillissement, particularly looking at age discrimination. I also want to highlight that Dr. Lagacé has been a champion of the IMHR, which is the Institute for Mental Health Research at the Royal Hospital. She's affiliated with that as well, and also has really championed the new Interdisciplinary Center for Black Health. And I really want to highlight those contributions, particularly in the context of this conference. So I'll be quiet now and let Dr. Lagacé come up.
Alors, merci beaucoup, chers collègues, directeur de l'école de psychologie. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, dear speakers, welcome to the second day of the Conference on the Mental Health of Black Communities in Canada. Comme il a été mentionné, donc, je suis Martine Lagacé, je travaille au bureau de la recherche, promotion et développement de la recherche à l'Université d'Ottawa. Écoutez, j'avais préparé un petit speech bien formel, mais je pense que je vais y aller plus avec mon cœur. Mon collègue disait tantôt combien pour moi ça a été important d'appuyer le professeur Jude Marissena dans sa démarche, pas plus qu'il y a une année, de création donc, de ce centre qui réfléchit au bien-être, à la santé des communautés noires. Vous savez, on a 23 centres et instituts de recherche à l'Université d'Ottawa et à chaque fois, c'est une compétition pour la création d'un nouveau centre et institut de recherche. Et quand Jude m'a approché notre bureau, on s'est dit que c'était un incontournable d'appuyer la création d'un centre comme celui-ci. Un centre qui réfléchit justement à des questions d'équité, d'inclusion, de diversité aux dimensions de la vulnérabilité par rapport aux communautés noires. Et je le dis sincèrement aujourd'hui, pour moi, j'ai mis ça dans ma liste prioritaire de création de centres et instituts de recherche parce que je pense que c'était quelque chose qui manquait à l'Université d'Ottawa. Donc, je veux prendre cette opportunité ce matin que j'ai de vous adresser la parole en remerciant tout le comité de leadership du centre et particulièrement, je dirais, la vision, l'esprit visionnaire de son directeur, le professeur Jude Marissena. Avant d'aller plus loin, je voudrais cependant rendre hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de la terre sur laquelle se situe l'Université d'Ottawa. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old. We honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. This comprehensive conference on the mental health of Black and racialized communities, hosted in partnership with the Faculty of Social Science V-TRaC Lab, is a testimony to the center's vitality, excellence, and leadership in this area of research. As we know, mental health has become a top public health priority in Canada, and it is vital that multi-level governments, research institutions, healthcare stakeholders, community leaders, and citizens address collectively what research documents as being race-based mental health disparities. Discussions and research outcomes to be shared during this conference will contribute to draw up a comprehensive research canvas about mental health issues affecting Black communities and likely contribute to inform public policy and raise awareness with the general public. Je me permets aussi de souligner en tant que chercheuse moi-même dans le domaine de la santé qui travaille sur les questions de stigmates et de stéréotypes et de préjugés liés, dans mon cas, à la question de l'âge. Tout le travail qui est fait par le centre et les réflexions autour des 2 jours m'interpellent particulièrement. Il y a toute la notion d'intersectionnalité, on voit le croisement de stigmates liés aux questions culturelles, aux questions de race, qui viennent souvent interagir avec les questions de l'âge. Je jasais justement il y a 2 minutes avec Jude en lui disant que ce serait un plaisir pour moi de me joindre à votre centre et de travailler sur les populations âgées racialisées. Il y a très peu de recherches qui sont faites là-dessus, donc ce sera un plaisir. Yesterday's opening conference by Dr. Kwame Mackenzie from the University of Toronto set the stage for this 3-day conference by addressing the question of Black mental health equity and charting the roadmap to achieve it. Today's session will explore topics including children and youth mental health, non-racist intervention in mental health, and justice and mental health. Clearly, understanding and acknowledging racial mental health disparities and their causes is key to reduce and eliminate them. So we're very grateful to the many experts and speakers gathered at University of Ottawa for this important event, as they can shine a light on the obstacles to overcome and the gaps to bridge in order to improve the mental health of Black and racialized communities in Canada. La bonne santé mentale et le bien-être au sein de toute notre communauté universitaire sont une priorité. Les études multidisciplinaires menées sur cette thématique dans nos facultés, dans nos centres et instituts de recherche participent d'ailleurs, incluant bien sûr le centre qui est dirigé par Jude, participent pleinement à cette stratégie pour faire avancer la science dans ce domaine et contribuer à la santé des Canadiennes et des Canadiens dans une perspective de qualité de vie et de longévité, bien sûr. So we're very proud to support research and knowledge mobilization fully in line with the goal of achieving Black health equity in Canada. Sans plus tarder, je passe la parole donc au maître d'œuvre de cette conférence, mon collègue Jude-Marie Sénat. I wish you all a successful, fruitful, and impactful conference. Merci beaucoup.
Are you ready for today? I think we will be joined by at least 100 other people. And thank you, Martin. I want also to take this opportunity to thank Martin for all the support to the center and all the support of the Office of Vice President's Research for the center. We still need more support from the university, but we have to agree that the support was like immediate, and we feel the support, and we know il y en a pas assez sur la santé des communautés noires, donc ce qui fait que à cause des lacunes, on en a besoin de plus de support encore, mais on doit reconnaître que le centre a été supporté tout de suite par le bureau du vice-rectorat à la recherche, non seulement le centre, mais également le laboratoire. Merci encore, Martin. It is an honor to introduce our first speaker for today. Let me introduce my colleague, Monnica Williams, Dr. Monnica Williams. Dr. Monnica Williams is an associate professor in the School of Psychology here at the University of Ottawa. She's also the Canada Research Chair on mental health disparities. She have done a lot of work on the impact of racism on mental health. And I think we have a chance to have Monnica Williams with us in Canada. She's from the US, and having Monnica in Canada, I think is a great chance. And it is also an opportunity for a lot of Black scholars to learn from her. And it is really a pleasure to introduce her today. And she will speak to us on the traumatizing impact of racism in Black Canadians. Please welcome Dr. Monnica Williams.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. You know, as Dr. Sanat mentioned, I am from the US. I came here about a little over 3 years ago to, you know, to do work on mental health disparities at the University of Ottawa. One of the first things that I discovered, even before I came here, is that there's no data. And my attempts to acquaint myself with the landscape in Canada were frustrating, because I couldn't actually find anything about the mental health of people of color in Canada, much less Black people. So, so I said, well, I guess I'll have plenty of work to do when I get here. And so that's where things are at. All right. And so I'm going to be sharing from a paper that we wrote recently, which is a review of the scarce literature on the impact of racism on people of color in Canada, focusing on Black people. And I'm also going to share with you a little bit of the research that we've done in our lab since I've been here. And here are, you can see a few of our, some of the folks who helped put this together. So thank you. All right, and I want to start off with this quote from Angela Davis, who says, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. And that's because in a society that privileges white people and whiteness, racist ideas are considered normal. They permeate our media, our culture, our social systems, and our institutions. And so to create an equal society, we have to commit to making unbiased choices and being anti-racists in all aspects of our lives. And so being anti-racist also is a fight, because we are swimming against the tide and we're fighting for fairness, which is fighting against racism. Now, how do we define racism? So racism can be defined as a system of beliefs, in other words, racial prejudices, practices, which is racial discrimination, and policies. And these are based on an individual's presumed race, and that operates to advantage those with historical power, which in the Western world is white people. This is a social caste system that's used to categorize people based on shared physical and social features. And I should point out that this system is made up. So Statistics Canada determines what some of these groups are. They change the groups every now and then. That does not mean anything biological changed in people who are in the groups. It just means that it was changed how we define them. So it's really important to understand that this is a social construction. And also, anyone can have racial biases. And in fact, we all have racial biases because we live in a racially biased society. And even people of color can harbor racism because it affects everyone. So here I want to talk about a couple of types of racism. These are some terms you may or may not be familiar with. Most people, when they think of racism, they think of what we call dominative or old-fashioned racism. And this is the kind of overt racism that you see behind acts of bigotry, such as racial slurs or threats or violence. And most people have no trouble identifying this kind of racism. But there are many other kinds of racism, and some would argue these other kinds are actually a bigger problem because they often go unnoticed and affect things in a very wide scale. So for example, symbolic racism, which is also called modern racism, or is very similar to modern racism. This consists of negative attitudes and stereotypes about people of color. Examples include viewing Black people as inferior or lazy or having criminal or aggressive tendencies. We sometimes call this right-wing racism, and it's sort of based in the idea that maybe Black people have some defective culture. Another type of racism is aversive racism, and this is characterized by people who claim to be supportive of people of color, and yet they still harbor biases. Maybe they're unconscious, maybe they're conscious, but when nobody's watching, they behave just like the other racists. And so we call this left-wing racism. And we see a lot of it on campuses, right? Yeah. So, and sometimes for people of color, this can be one of the more frustrating types of racism, right? Because you might have somebody that, you know, won a diversity award and then they do something racist to you and you're like, what's that about, right? So another type of racism is internalized racism. And this is when people of color have negative ideas and thoughts about other people of color. And even Black people can have negative thoughts about Black people and feel a lot of shame and self-loathing and low self-esteem as a result of it, and feel like maybe it's better if they're white, right? Because we have so many white ideals and role models in our society that it's easy to think that maybe that's better. And then also we have on here everyday racism. And this refers to the unrecognized and unacknowledged acts of racism that occur in day-to-day situations through various practices that reinforce power relations between groups. And so similar to everyday racism or microaggressions, these concepts almost completely overlap, whereby microaggressions are, they can be subtle, covert acts of racism. They can be backhanded compliments. They can be patronizing statements. It could be in the form of white saviorism. And so these, and also microaggressions, sometimes they're not actions, sometimes they're just things that have been set up in the environment. Like, for example, naming a university after someone who set up a bunch of, indigenous schools that abused indigenous children, right? So even just saying the name of a university like that every time you say it's a microaggression. So microaggressions are everywhere. And then finally on here we have structural racism, and this refers to the systems of institutional and public policies and practices that maintain inequities and disadvantage people of color. And so these are embedded in all of our social systems, and it's been structured in a way that will limit the ability of people of color to access the same social, educational, economic, and political opportunities. And so racism is not just about an act of violence or prejudice, but it's actually like embedded in our whole society. And so, so that leaves us with a lot of work to do, and it leaves a lot of unacknowledged racism that Black people are dealing with every day. All right, so Canada is advanced as a multicultural country, and Canadian society considers itself colorblind, which means not seeing or taking race into consideration. Unfortunately, this approach fails to recognize the lived experience of Canadians of color, and a lot of the emphasis on multiculturalism in Canada actually serves to obscure and hide these racial differences. And I remember the first time I visited Canada, I went to a conference in Toronto, and I had heard like all these wonderful things about Canada, and I'm like, oh yes, I'm going to Canada. I'm going to be like free from racism, at least even if it's just for a weekend. And you're all, why are you laughing? Yeah, right. So I got there, I got to Toronto, I got to the hotel, and I noticed like the bellhops, like pushing the bags, were all Black people, and like the important people were all white people. And I'm like, this seems a lot like America. I'm not seeing any differences here. And we had a karaoke night planned, and I was there with my students, and we had, just this wonderful, beautiful group of diverse students that I brought with me from America. And we all went out to the place where the karaoke was planned, and there was a big table reserved for our conference. And we all sat down, and somebody came up to me and was like, oh, I'm sorry, this table's reserved. I'm like, oh, really? For what? Oh, it's reserved for some psychologists. And I'm like, really? I'm thinking, so what makes you think that we're not psychologists, right? Yeah, so anyway, yeah, that was my initiation to Canadian society. What can I say? What can I say? Yeah, so there's racism in Canada. I hope this isn't a surprise to anybody. So it was a surprise to me. It was a little disappointing. Okay. Also, I mean, Canadians actually don't even really have a good idea of the diversity of the Canadian people. This figure represents the proportion of people of color in the Canadian population and future projections. And the blue bar represents visible minorities, is classified by Statistics Canada, and then Indigenous people in the yellow. And what you see is an increasing trajectory of diversity. So right now we have 11.5 million people of color in Canada, including Indigenous people, and that makes up 30% of all Canadians. Now, with regard to race, Canadians tend to view the United States as a racist country, which is not untrue, and Canada as non-racist. But this could only be true if we ignore and minimize colonial and contemporary racism. In general, white Canadians are not sufficiently aware of the settler colonial history and its legacies, and also the diversity of what constitutes the Canadian people. And racism is embedded in our history here, as seen by the fact that there was legal slavery, there was Chinese head tax, colonialism, residential schools, Japanese internment camps, the destruction of Africville, and so on. And so racism continues to exist at both individual and structural levels in our society. And we see this even today with racial profiling of Black Canadians by law enforcement, the maltreatment of Indigenous people, and forced sterilization, violence, and other ongoing acts. So in addition to these overt acts, there's also implicit biases that people hold. And we did a study of implicit biases in Canadians. And actually, I started this project even before I came here because I thought, well, I'm going to be moving to Canada. I guess I should know what I'm getting into. So we pulled all of the IAT data, the implicit associations test data, from that the website where that's collected, to look at the levels of, frankly, of anti-Black bias in Canada. And we compared this nationally, actually. And we found anti-Black bias really in every Western country, including Canada. And it was actually strikingly similar level of anti-Black bias between Canada, the United States, and other countries, other English-speaking and European countries. So that was sad but true. Okay, and implicit biases are generally considered unconscious in nature. And so implicit biases can be positive or negative attitudes and stereotypes that you might hold to somebody from a racial outgroup. I mean, you could have an implicit bias about anything, but for the sake of conversation, we're talking about racial biases, and these can automatically influence a person's behavior without them realizing it and lead to the commission of subtle racist acts. And we actually see this starting at a very early age, as young as 4 years old. In the States, we have documented racial profiling by preschool teachers of their Black children in the preschool. And those are thought to be expressions of implicit bias. Now, explicit biases are your conscious, positive or negative attitudes. And usually these are things people can self-report pretty accurately. And these implicit and explicit biases are related, although sometimes reinforcing, but distinct constructs that can be measured separately. So, and here's a little example of this. We see this woman in the library asks the librarian, "Can you help me find something on the white male experience?" Right? How is he going to answer that, right? So, so the fact that this is such a weird question is an illustration of the bias that we have in our culture, whereby you ask that about any other group and it makes sense. Okay. All right, so now we're going to do some comparisons between the US and Canada. And, and as an American, I have no problem throwing my country under the bus. That being said, if we look at this is a measure, a more explicit measure of bias. These are warmth ratings. And this is using that data from that implicit associations test. And it's really like a very simple, pure test. It's like, how much do you like Black people on a scale of 0 to 10, pretty much? And 0 is you feel extremely cold, and 10 is you feel extremely warm. And these are considered pretty rough indicators of explicit bias held by different ethno-racial groups toward Black people. So we asked, people who identified as East Asian, South Asian, white, Hispanic white, indigenous, like, what do how do you feel about Black people? And you can see that the numbers are fairly similar across groups, across countries, actually. So, can you see that? Oh yeah, in the corner there, that's just the N for that. The US N is 443,000. Smaller numbers for Canada, almost 7,000. So, and this has been published already. And we actually then did another analysis where we looked at predictors of health outcomes. So predictors of suicide in Black people, predictors of drug-induced mortality, predictors of alcohol-induced mortality. And we used some of the variables from this, from this survey. So we included the modern racism scale, which is another scale of explicit bias. And we included the implicit bias test. And we controlled for the white mortality across these different outcomes. And we were only able to do this study in the US because the numbers don't exist in Canada. They don't collect mortality numbers by province in Canada. So we could only do this particular analysis with the US data. And the reviewers weren't happy about that, but it is what it is. And what we find here is that these constructs significantly predict Black American mental health after controlling for white American mental health and explicit biases. We see that not only explicit biases, but implicit biases are also predicting these outcomes even to a stronger degree than the explicit bias. And so suicide and drug-induced mortality were very significant. Alcohol-induced mortality was only marginally significant. And so this indicates that the more racism people have to deal with, the worse their mental health outcomes. And it looks, again, like implicit bias is the bigger problem over explicit bias. So, so don't worry if you want to study this more, it'll be in your handouts if you want to nerd out on that, but we did publish it, so. Now, much of the research on the impacts of racism, again, has been conducted in the United States and applied to the Canadian context. And this has been necessary because of the problematic gap in the Canadian literature, and that this racial data is only now starting to be collected. But we know from American, Australian, and British research that racism has significant mental health impacts on people of color. But we still need to do more work here to really uncover and document these problems. And and I'm very excited to be here at the U Ottawa where we're doing that, and with colleagues like Dr. Sanat and the center where some of these things are now coming to light. And what we're finding it's like not good. I mean, it's good that we're publishing it, but the findings are not good. And so now I want to discuss experiences of racism and racial trauma. Racial trauma refers to the cumulative effects of racism on a person's mental health. It includes the reactions to direct or even vicarious exposure to real or perceived threats, experiences of humiliation, shame, fear, and racial discrimination toward people of color. It is associated with anxiety, depression, despair, suicidal ideation, and even poor physical health. For example, outcomes like high blood pressure, and so forth. And so experiencing racial discrimination is considered one factor that may account for higher rates of PTSD in people of color. And so, and it's important to point out that, that these experiences are cumulative. Here are some examples of things, of race-based traumas that can cause PTSD. And these may include things like overt racial slurs and threats made in any environment by anyone. The fact that that a person feels emboldened to make a racial threat often means that they're capable of carrying it out. Police harassment, body searches and assaults, workplace discrimination, community violence, distressing medical experiences, and this includes forced and coerced sterilization, incarceration, immigration difficulties, and that includes experiences that may have forced people to flee from their countries of origin. It could include experiences in different countries as a person tries to find safety, and it can include experiences that they have once they arrive in their new home. And deportation can also be quite traumatic. So additionally, racial trauma can be inherited through a mechanism called epigenetics. And so traumatic environmental insults can cause modifications in gene expression that can be passed from a parent to a child and then even to a grandchild without actual changes in the DNA sequence. And that's called epigenetics. And we have now measured how health disparities can be observed among certain groups because of things that happened to their predecessors. For example, Jewish Holocaust survivors and Native and indigenous populations that may have traumatic histories. And then we see some symptoms downstream. And so in this conceptual framework, stress-induced epigenetic effects that were established in past generations affect the health of descendant generations. And this provides a mechanism whereby how we can understand how historical trauma can, that may be rooted in initial traumatic encounters, can have ongoing effects, long after the original trauma. And so here is a diagram, or I don't know, does this qualify as an infographic? Maybe. So this that illustrates the mental health impact of racism. And so you see, you have these, environmental epigenetic vulnerabilities and environmental stressors from historical and cultural trauma. And then you add that to a person's experience of overt and covert racism, so that implicit and explicit racism, and trauma is cumulative. And so, so you could add to it a traumatic event or even like a small event. And the next thing you know, you've pushed the person over from being stressed to being traumatized. And then somebody who may seek help for their trauma, maybe they want to talk to somebody. Often when people talk about their experiences of racism, they are met with invalidation. People don't believe it. People want proof. People say, oh, it's not that bad. They make excuses. And that compounds the trauma even more. And then if somebody wants to get help, they may run into barriers to treatment due to institutional racism. So maybe they can't afford mental health care, or maybe there's nobody in their community that's qualified to treat racial trauma, or they can't find a clinician of their same ethnic group, or they can't find a clinician that speaks their language, right? So these are all barriers to treatment. And so as a result, you have, these symptoms that are maintained or exacerbated, and then the person may become disabled. So there are approximately 1.2 million Black Canadians. 44% are citizens by birth. according to Statistics Canada. And they experience some very distinct socioeconomic disadvantages. They tend to have lower income, have more educational barriers. They experience daily acts of racism, anything from being stared at by strangers to strange superficial interactions, having opinions ignored or devalued. Black Canadians experience, disproportionately high rates of police harassment, partying, racial profiling, and hostile or violent interactions. This didn't used to be the case a few decades ago, but today, Black people are incarcerated at much higher rates than would be predicted based on the population numbers. And some of that is due to stigma based on the war on drugs, which is a whole nother lecture that I could give you. We won't get into today. But we find that anti-Black racism is actually embedded in law enforcement practices. Racial profiling is definitely going on, but this is nothing new. The police have been a mechanism of, segregation and oppression against Black people for, decades or centuries. So, what's happening today isn't anything new. But we know what little data we have, we can definitely show a racist pattern. Black Canadians are over 2 times more likely than whites to be stopped by police in Ottawa, 6 times more likely to be carded in Halifax, overrepresented on street checks in Vancouver, and 20 times more likely to be fatally shot in Toronto. So, so problems like this contribute to psychosocial stressors, such as race-based stress, financial adversity, and broken families. And so when we talk about the experience of Black Canadians, again, there's a significant socioeconomic disadvantage compared to many other ethno-racial groups. The unemployment rates for Black women are 2 times higher, and for Black men, 1.5 times higher than white counterparts. We see greater discrimination in the hiring process, greater food insecurity for Black youth, and adversities in education, family dynamics, and criminal justice systems, and also housing discrimination, particularly for those with darker skin. So there's a lot of colorism that happens here as well. And so a combination of these socioeconomic and psychological disadvantages has implications, again, for this race-based stress and racial trauma. We see higher rates of hypertension in Black people, even compared to not just white people, but Asian and South Asian people, due to historic and current racially motivated events. A lot of Black people are mistrustful of healthcare professionals. And it's interesting, I wrote a paper on the mistrust of Black people of mental health care. And I was very dismayed to see that when it was published, the editor had changed the title of the paper to "Misconceptions About Psychotherapy Linger in Some Communities." And I'm like, I don't think these are misconceptions, right? It's not a misconception that that we can't find therapists who understand our experience, and that Black people do receive inferior quality of care. So, and needless to say, this interferes with the mental health and health of Black Canadians. And here's some data from a recent study that we did, where we were able to get some data from a national survey that was launching, and we were able to include some mental health questions for and we wanted to understand what the specific barriers to mental health care were that people were experiencing, and we wanted to particularly look at differences by ethno-racial group. And these were some of the barriers that were identified, and there were significant differences between groups. And we found that, one of the big issues was not being able to find someone who speaks my preferred language, right? And this was particularly a problem for South Asian people and also Black people. And this one here could not find someone of my race or ethnic group. This was one of the main issues reported by Black people who really wanted to find a Black clinician but couldn't, and that's like a quarter. And then also several groups reported negative experiences with mental health professionals. And we see that like a third of Black people said they'd had prior negative experiences. So, which is interesting because a lot of white people did too. So I kind of feel like that's on us as mental health practitioners, right? And so this problem is pronounced for Black Canadians. And here is an article actually that came out recently that, has two of our dear colleagues that were featured in this article. And we know that in psychology, there's not enough Black psychologists to do the work. I mean, there's just not enough psychologists, period. Anyone who's tried to find a psychologist, but like find a Black psychologist, like forget it. There's just not enough of us to serve the community. So this is a big problem. It says here, psychology professionals say that there's racism in the accreditation practices need to change. I'm not going to say that, but it could be true. There could be some problems. And and then also, there are also unique and additional difficulties faced by immigrants and refugees who come to Canada. And there's a lot of diversity within these groups. Researchers have tended to lump them together as a monolithic group, making it hard to evaluate and get a definitive picture on these groups. But we know that they face different barriers based on race. And I think I'm gonna stop there and take some questions. That's my last word. So Canada has no excuse for remaining ignorant and indifferent to the prevalence of racism in society and its deleterious impacts. So I think we have to do better. There's a resource that I want to promote.
There's a microphone for questions, so raise your hand and Grace will bring you the microphone. A question from Martin.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Williams, for une présentation qui nous ouvre davantage l'esprit sur l'importance de travailler sur les problématiques liées à l'inéquité en soins de santé. I have a question regarding, a stereotype is a stereotype, a bias is a bias. And one of your slides was showing the positive biases. I think it was implicit or explicit positive biases. Are there any studies that were conducted in terms of the impact of positive biases? Because they're hiding something. And in my view, I think the impact should be obviously negative, but do you know of any studies conducted on positive biases?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we know, for example, among people of Asian heritage, there's a stereotype that they're, good at math and science. And I think that that could work well for you if you're good at math and science. But think about the Asian kid who's not good at math and science, right? And we know that has like a negative impact on people's self-esteem when there's positive biases and people don't feel that they can meet those. So,
I saw the charts out there when you're talking about barriers to care by race and ethnicity. And I was wondering, was there any studies that focus on being able to not only access care by those that are representative, but for those who have a specific research and study in anti-Black racism and being able to get care that is specific to that experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we're there yet with the data in terms of like, if people who are suffering from racial stress and trauma, how many of them are able to find care for that? I mean, so many mental health studies don't even consider the impact of racism on mental health, and they're not measuring it or tracking it. We are starting to do that research here. In our own study, we found, just in the process of trying to validate some of the measures we've been creating about racial trauma, like up to like a third of the people of color that we included in our study had, like clinically relevant amounts of racial trauma. So, and we know that the vast majority, 80% of clinicians have no training at all, even in treating or identifying racial trauma. So, so it would be miraculous if they were able to get help. So.
Thank you for your presentation. That was excellent. My name is Rob, and I'm with the 613-819 Black Hub. We're a Black political advocacy group, and we do a lot of work on policing. So I was really glad to see the stats you brought out around that, because I got to admit, I'm loving the conference, but there isn't a session dedicated to the effect of policing on mental health, which there should have been. Just one thing with the Ottawa police that wasn't in there was that their use of force race data came out also, and it also shows that they disproportionately use force on Black, Indigenous, and Middle Eastern people. But I'm curious, that stat that did jump out at me, the stat where the negative experiences in mental health, the white folks were higher. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because one of the things we were hypothesizing is that people of color would have more negative experience with clinicians who may not understand them or may microaggress against them. A lot of white people complained that they had negative experiences too that were a barrier. And I think we need to do more research to unpack that. But we know that like our whole health system here in Canada is like broken, and the mental health care system is super broken. I mean, it takes, just at our clinic here where students are treating people, it takes a year to get in just to see a student. So, I'm surprised. I'm not surprised that people aren't happy, but I don't know. We have to really like look more and figure out what's going on there. So
Hi, thank you so much for providing such beautiful education, but also like saddening. And I feel like this is, the second day of the conference. And as someone who has studied psychology and mental health for a while now, a lot of the information that is being presented to me, especially as a Black person, I already know this, and especially as a Black person working in mental health. And so I'm wondering, how long have you been having this conversation with people, and what has been your experience, and are there any frustrations? Because I feel like as I'm learning more and more about this, I feel like we know this and these are facts, but there seems to be a resistance to, I don't know, putting them into action. So I'm wondering, what's your experience in terms of advocating for this and putting this information out there?
yeah, good question. So, when I first started doing talks like this, a lot of people were actually confused because they couldn't understand how racism could cause trauma. Although Black people were always like nodding, like, yeah, of course. So, so it wasn't confusing to them. But I think now there's enough information out there that I think most clinicians, I hope, have at least heard of this. And there doesn't seem to be as much confusion about it, but people still are reluctant to do anything because they don't know what to do. And also race is still like such a taboo topic. People have trouble just talking about it. And if you can't even talk about it, how the heck are you going to like implement interventions and stuff? And, I mean, and I don't know, Jude and I could go on about even just the challenges that we had putting together a group for students who had experienced racial trauma. But yeah, I think in principle, people want to do something, but they don't know how, or they don't know what to do.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Dr. Monnica, for presenting this information. My question is, one of the things that I struggle with as a mental health professional is the limitations to confidentiality. And so in moments as a practitioner, when I'm working with racialized folks, and the limitations of confidentiality are, if you report self-harm, if there's safety issues related to childcare or child safety, then systems become involved, right? And those systems often when that information goes beyond us and it goes to those systems, we know that those systems can cause harm and further harm. So I guess as a community of mental health professionals, is there something being done to address that within the college and our governing bodies in terms of that requirement and where we can go that isn't further perpetuating that harm to bring these services into the lives of the communities that are already marginalized and that are already impacting the higher rates of harmful effects of contact with police and harmful effects of connecting with childcare or child welfare in that way? So that is my question. So I'm hoping maybe you have a simple solution.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
No pressure.
This is a real problem, right? But I mean, the problem is really that these systems are all racist. And so we can't count on them to help us when we need it. Like if I needed if somebody broke into my home and I needed the police to come and protect me, I would be afraid to call them because I don't know if when they come, they're going to assume that I'm the criminal and harm me, right? So, so the problem is like these systems need to be transformed, and actually a lot of the writing that I've been publishing lately has been on how to make these systems more equitable. We actually have, we're doing a special issue on power, privilege, and oppression in individuals and institutions in frontiers. And so anybody who'd like to contribute to that, we're trying to stimulate more discussion and solutions around how to fix these systems. But if anybody knows anything specific that's going on to address these things, you're welcome to share. I don't know of any. I'm sure somebody's doing something. I like to think that anyway.
Hi, thank you for your presentation today. So my question is regarding diversity training. It's something that is becoming more and more popular, but then a few weeks ago, I participated at a conference on burnout.
Yeah.
And the presenters weren't, there was no diversity, and the way that they presented it, there was nothing related to the racial lens. And when I asked the question,
yeah,
the answer I got was, well, we didn't have enough time.
Oh,
and
no.
We make sure that, you know, all of our employees are being culturally sensitive, and we do have the DEI training. But then I didn't see that in their presentation, and even the way that they argued, you know, of why, it didn't make any sense to me. So we're putting a lot of money on DEI training, and yet I'm seeing that it's not being properly integrated. How can we change that?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, a lot of like workplaces are offering or even requiring these trainings, but not because they really care that anybody learns it, but it's just sort of a way to cover their butt. And say, well, we trained everyone on that, so it's not our problem. It's not our fault if someone's, you know, racist. And so we have to like sort of get away from that thinking and into like, how do we actually like, you know, create an anti-racist workplace? And unfortunately, a lot of these trainings are offered by, you know, groups that, I mean, that's like their business, but they're not necessarily backed by research and science. And so I think we need to be, you know, using the science to measure the outcomes of the trainings, and, you know, and going with the ones that like actually work, because there are good ones too. There's good ones and bad ones. And the average consumer isn't really going to know the difference. I mean, you know, of course, you and I will know the difference as soon as we go and take it, but most people don't really know the difference. So, so I think there needs to be like a little more, I don't know, emphasis on, you know, the actual goal of creating sort of equitable spaces for people. But another problem too is like a lot of us who do these trainings, we're like all burned out. I mean, I get a request every day to do a talk or training. So, you know, unfortunately, there's a lot to be done. There's not enough of us to do it. So I don't know how to fix that problem. I have like some white colleagues who give these trainings who are great, but then people are like, well, we don't want to hear this from a white guy. So I don't know how we fix that piece of it.
Hi, thank you. So I'm a registered social worker as well. And so I'm thinking about my training and a lot of the things in relation to what we're talking about. I also provide these anti-O kind of workshops a lot of the time. And I think that's a dynamic that comes up a lot for me as well, is this insistence to not want to like take that advice from white people specifically. People are like, oh, I need to hear it from a person of color for it to be legitimate, quote unquote. Whereas I think I'm tired of talking about these things all of the time. Like I'm just exhausted of having to like rehash my own traumatic experiences for white folks who don't want to learn those concepts from other white people, which I think is the point of allyship. So why aren't we doing that? But my reflection was actually about training and thinking about the efficacy of training like this and how we can evaluate it. So I'm wondering when we're like, if there's a something integrated into the Mental Health for Everyone program that you folks have developed that is going to evaluate efficacy or learning outcomes and things like that. Because thinking back towards my own education and even now my current experiences with schools of social work and this is where the training is happening and there are so many significant issues and I'm wondering if I mean I may be speaking from a bit of a pessimistic point of view, but I'm kind of concerned that considering the sheer issues in the training of mental health professionals in Canada, that it might not be possible for us to fully do this without actively like also encouraging the active participation of more Black folks and other folks of color in these fields.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so it's true. I mean, I think, you know, the diversity training that mental health professionals are getting is like woefully inadequate. And, you know, and I think a program like this one is like a great start, but it also have to have an experiential piece. You can't just learn it by reading. You actually have to like do stuff. So, but I don't know, I'll let Dr. Sanat talk about if any outcomes are being measured from the program.
Let's just say like we just have a project where we are going to first evaluate a little of it will be like 800 mental professionals before the training. Then they will take the training and we'll evaluate both the patients before they take the training. Then we'll evaluate the mental health professionals and also patients after they take the training and 1 year after they take the training to see what is the problem.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very helpful. And we're really excited about, you know, the aspect of this anti-racism training for mental health professionals. One thing we were wondering is, we're seeing an increase more of dual diagnosis. It's no longer just mental health. There are other things and underlying issues, whether it's a developmental disability or a physical disability, a lot of things that are playing factors. And a lot of times they're very separated. So we were just wondering in regards to this training for mental health professionals, if there were some of those other aspects looked into it as well. And are there other frontline staff that are dealing with multitude of complexities that this would be beneficial for, or is it just that one lens?
I think this is good for everyone, but I'm going to punt that one over to Dr. Sanat as well.
Oh, thank you, Monica. I think it's an entry-level training. It's a beginning step to the basic. There are 5 modules that take professionals through from the basics about what racism is. And looking at, for example, humanistic approaches to medication, working with people from Black communities, children and families. It's a basic, it's a good foundation. But I think more needs to be done. And I think we've heard today how there's such a gap that we do need to start somewhere, and we'll see what the outcomes are, and then work from there. So there's a lot more work to be done.
And I also think like universities need to implement that sort of training. Yes. Because we can just take this example in Ontario. In Ontario, like around 50% of the social work program. I'm sorry. In Ontario, about 50% of the program in social work don't have a training on cultural aspects of practicing social work. And how you can do that, because in Ontario, there are 150 cultural backgrounds, people with different cultural backgrounds. So we need the universities to implement training. Like you cannot be a social worker, and at any point in your training, people don't talk to you, like your professors don't talk to you about racial, cultural aspects, but also racial aspects. We need the university to do that work. And what we do in that training is a good foundation, but we continue to develop the training. We have a an assessment committee. They just finished the work, and now we are going to have the version 2. So we continue the work, but we need the university also to do their part. Do you want to 30 seconds to conclude, if you want?
Okay, right. Yeah, well, yeah, thank you for listening to my talk, and certainly feel free to reach out to me if you had questions that we weren't able to get to. I'm available by email. It's really easy. It's just like monica.williams@uottawa.ca. Just don't forget there's 2 N's in Monica, and I'm happy to follow up with you. So thank you.
It is maybe important to note also all the work done by Monnica in psychedelic aspects of mental health. And I think it is, there is a certificate here at Ottawa in psychedelic studies. So it is also important to note this.